I just thought it would be really important to kind of come and show up honestly in my approach to the work. I'm somebody from all these different backgrounds, and so therefore my lived reality really, really informs what I say and how I am in the world. So I am not like an activist or an academic or a person who talks about issues claiming to be some independent or objective, or kind of divorcing my head from my heart. I kind of, all that stuff is part of how I see what I talk about and what I think. And so therefore, some of what my analysis will be totally and utterly informed by how I've experienced these things of being a Muslim, a woman, child refugee, heterosexual, Arab, Shia, blah, blah, blah. So, and diaspora child-ish. So that kind of thing is important for me to share with you all. Then I thought it would be good to talk about some clarifications around the terms and definitions around these big concepts of Islamophobia, feminism, Islamic feminism, and violence against women and girls. It's really interesting that to this date, we do not have an agreed definition of Islamophobia in kind of official state structures, but that's not a surprise, really, knowing what the state thinks about Muslims. But what I've thought about was bringing together or highlighting the UN definition of Islamophobia. And it's of note that this year, on the 15th of March, they created a new campaign for the United Nations called the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. And like I said, it's on the 15th of March. And they define Islamophobia as a fear, prejudice, and hatred of Muslims that leads to provocation, hostility, and intolerance by means of threatening, harassment, abuse, incitement, and intimidation of Muslims and non-Muslims, interestingly, both in the online and offline world. It is motivated by institutional, ideological, political, and religious hostility that transcends into structural and cultural racism. It targets the symbols and markers of being Muslim. And that's an interesting definition because it tries to connect the individual to the structural, and it kind of tries to say that it bleeds into racism, and hopefully that's much more understood as a concept. Interestingly, it doesn't kind of specifically mention women and their unique experiences of Islamophobia and what gendered Islamophobia feels like, or hostility and Islamophobia intersecting with kind of disability or views of around sexuality, etc. But I think that's kind of a debate on how we understand that with regards to our intersectional lives. Then there is the other definition, which is the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the definition of Islamophobia, or British Muslims, which defines Islamophobia as rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Again, conflation of sort of this definition tries to kind of convey that you may not be Muslim, but you might look Muslim, whatever that look means, and therefore could be subject and targeted of it. So you don't even have to be a Muslim to be subjected to Islamophobia. And our Sikh brothers and sisters will know about that quite well. Also, what's really important to say is that kind of a formal interrogation of the phenomena of Islamophobia started out with the Runnymede report in 2001. And that really centered around the watershed moment of the Salman Rushdie affair with the satanic verses and what seemed to be the rise of Islamic visibility in the public space, particularly in relation to politics and the way we talk about important things in the public space. So that's Islamophobia. Feminism, I thought it would be good to kind of revisit and discuss, and we could do like 3 coffee mornings about that, but let's just kind of bear with me with my very simple explanation of what it means to me. So in the widest sense, it's the general concern with women's issues and awareness that women suffer discrimination at work, in the home, and in society because of their gender, stroke sex. Feminist work is the action that is aimed at improving their lives and changing circumstances of women so that they are more equal. And then I referred to a feminist theologian, a Catholic feminist theologian, who I thought was really captured the definition for me that I think people can subscribe to from non-religious backgrounds. Her name is Rosemary Ruther, I think. And she says that feminism affirms the full humanity of women. This means that all the ways that women have been defined as inferior, secondary, and dependent on men since the rise of patriarchy are described as a cause for feminism to address. So that's kind of my take on feminism in its widest sense. Then a more controversial term is Islamic feminism. I think one of the things that I want to do in the future is kind of do a much more deep dive into that. But for now, I referred to Ziba Mir Hosseini's 2011 essay, is entitled "Beyond Islam versus Feminism," quote unquote, in which she reminds us that both the terms Islam and feminism are contested. Whose Islam and whose feminism, she asks. They mean different things to different people in different contexts and is used for different agendas, different politics, and different identities. It is also worth noting that often faith and feminism are juxtaposed against each other, as if equality and feminism can only exist with the absence of religion and faith. And I think all of us here kind of have some thoughts about that. But essentially, Islamic feminism is a feminism that takes its legitimacy from Islam. It is described by Ziba Mir Hosseini as the unwanted child of political Islam. And it emerged quite rightly and in a very women-centered way, in spite of the phenomenon of Islamism and a reaction to one of its grounding principles of the return to a so-called golden age of Sharia and interpretation and the interpretation of legal Islamic texts, which support and reinforce patriarchal and rigid notions of gender and the role of women in society. And so that is essentially the context in which Islamic feminism was born, where the fusion of faith and politics became the driving force for dissent and change in predominantly post-colonial Muslim majority countries. So again, Islamic feminism is inherently political. It cannot be kind of defined or left to or divorced from the public space. And one would argue that all feminism is in that way, shape or form. But I think the way in which political Islamic feminism has come about really is because men used religion to claim the public space and shape it. And then women came along and said, hang on a minute, if you're saying religion has a place in the public space, then I want to be part of that conversation in dividing and deciding how that happens and takes place. So yeah, that's really important for me on a cellular level. And then VAWG I define as violence against women and girls, and I'm hoping that we don't have to go deeper than that. But we might wish to discuss that further in the Q&A. So my next kind of slide. Before I go on, can you please, Elsa, tell me to shut up when it's time to shut up? Thank you. So then I look at my call for intersectionality in this slide, where I say that if we are to honor the concept of intersectionality, where quite rightly Kimberly Crenshaw uses it to illustrate the impact of class and race oppression on women's lives and the violence that they're subjected to, whether it's state violence, interpersonal, or kind of societal, then it's not too much of a stretch of the imagination to kind of recognize that the impact of Islamophobia, a form of prejudice and racism, and actually the impact or the importance of faith in Muslim women's lives have on their experiences of violence and patriarchy and gender discrimination and kind of sex discrimination. So I think it's really important that we, for me, if we are to kind of be inclusive of our understanding of the rights of women, then really it's important that we understand that faith, whether it's used by perpetrators, survivors, racists, secularists, needs to be incorporated in our analysis of how to support and serve women experiencing domestic abuse. And then I make another call for a faith-informed approach, because we all talk about recently the trauma-informed approach to work and practice with survivors. And I would argue that a trauma-informed approach compels us to understand the biological, physical, psychological, and emotional impact of violence on women and girls' lives and everyday realities, and how we are encouraged and find it quite important that as a movement, as practitioners, we and advocates, we have an awareness of that dynamic when we are working in this field. And I would argue that a similar understanding of faith is required and justified, because it's a powerful lens with which to understand a myriad of things, including spiritual abuse, but also spiritual healing, and the effective tool that spirituality and faith have and can be to end abuse, inequality, and harm, and provide us with a survivor-centered approach that's quite holistic and does not either repeat victimization or reinforces the abuser's narrative, or ask a survivor to leave certain parts of themselves at the door when they are in our spaces or when we are in their spaces. And then I kind of look at the idea of how the movement and I guess essentially Western inspired feminism impacts Muslim women's space for action, particularly survivors, and how their visible identities and cultural identities all have as an impact on the choices that they are able to make, both as women and as survivors. So if you don't know about Liz Kelly's space for action concept, or if we wanted a very basic kind of reminder, it's to kind of it really refers to the choices that survivors of violence and domestic and sexual abuse have in terms of controlling and exercising over their lives. And so the more abuse and violence is present in their lives, the less likely they are able to make choices that reflect their desires and their ability to have a life not that is beyond the definition of abuse or beyond the impact of abuse, or that kind of tries to end, limit, harm, etc. And so I feel like Muslim women in Western societies are subjected to multiple intersecting forms of patriarchal violence, racism, and Islamophobia. So for many in our own Muslim majority contexts, we are not religious enough, mainly from a patriarchal lens, but also from a fundamentalist faith lens. I would also say that for many kind of your generic Joe blogs, if there is such a thing, in Western society, we're too insular, we're not quote unquote assimilated enough. And that brings its own forms of violence that is specifically patriarchal. In our own feminist movement, we are sometimes seen as kind of brainwashed and not like feminist light, or actually not in charge of our own kind of we're not grounded in true quote unquote feminism, whatever that means, because unless it divorces religion from our identity and our desire for liberation, then we're not really feminist enough. And that in itself is a very particular form of violence against Muslim women. Also, we are too faith-centered, which speaks to the kind of the last point, is that we need saving, I suppose, and we both are not enlightened enough and too rigid in our beliefs. And I recognize that these are all things that any woman of faith could experience. But I think my interest is really, and my observations are really about, and add on top of that, Islamophobia. And you can really see that if you have a survivor who is either visibly Muslim or is associated with the culture of Islam, whatever that means, she is doomed. The cultural association with Islam and the conflation of Islam, migration, refugeeship, and immigration means that inevitably a Muslim woman is kind of doomed to violence and subjected to harmful practices, quote unquote, that she wouldn't somehow be subjected to if she wasn't in a Muslim cultural space or did not belong to that, as if we don't have harmful practices in non-religious and secular spaces and non sort of ethnic or majority white spaces. So that was really important to kind of delve into and intersect and dissect. So I guess I feel like Muslim women are both loathed and pitied. We can't be saved, we can't be erased. But can we be appropriated? I guess, Tommy Robinson's in the last 5 years before Brexit, just after Brexit, kind of had this instrumentalization of Muslim women. He suddenly was our savior who went on marches and said that, Muslim women need saving from their men and their Muslimness. And so, and it just shows how much of a weapon Muslim women have become, and how used they are by anyone claiming either to represent them, fight them, save them. And women themselves, Muslim women themselves, seem to lack the space to speak for themselves. Not that they can't, but it's just that they're not giving that opportunity. And so I think my last slide, you'll be pleased to know, is this one. That one is the kind of the exploration of the need for a Muslim women only space that is kind of beyond just survivors and the power dynamic of here's a survivor and I'm an advocate or a caseworker and I'm going to help you. Actually, it is for sector specific. And I think, my question is, again, this is all my own personal experiences of being somebody who kind of is both a survivor and also an advocate. And whether it's a survivor of Islamophobia, violence against women and girls, racism, all of that, it's again, all of you know what that is because you have lived experience of it. The last sort of 10 years have been about like who heals the healer and where do they go so that they carry on the fight and the patching up of the violence that patriarchy imposes on women. In the last slide, I talked about how we're not feminist enough for essentially the white women's sector, and we're too religious for the by and fors. Muslim women are not incorporated in, for example, Imkan's analysis of violence, state violence, and Black and minoritized women because of their faith. They are seen, they are included because of the cultural manifestations of Islamophobia and post-colonial experiences. They're not, Imkan doesn't do faith. Neither does by and fors like ICRO or Asian Women's Resource Center or I don't know, Imiche or any of those places. They don't formally recognize faith as a tool for women's healing and identity. They recognize it as the inevitable consequence and contributor of violence, not the contributor to ending violence. The only organization that does that in the UK is Muslim Women's Network UK, who kind of formally incorporates and takes up the fight for a women-centered approach to faith and Islam in a way that no other specialist by and for would do that. The only other space is probably Inclusive Mosque Initiative, who are our members, where they have a very feminist, anti-racist, abolitionist view of how Islam is essentially a liberation theology and practice, not one to be serviced in service to patriarchy. So that's really important for me to think about and reflect on. I also feel like the need for a Muslim women-only space more widely is the need for, if we come together as workers, advocates, healers, educators, then we can organize for change. We can bring our experiences together in community, and not only support, heal, but also think, strategize, just cause trouble together in a way that understands and serves our unique experiences. And also there is a very distinct lack of resources and tools that are for us, by us. So a dissection of our theological traditions, sacred text, cultural and religious practices that again center patriarchy. And if we go back to the definition of the theological definition, or the definition of feminism, where a Catholic theologist, Rosemary, was using, kind of this kind of a theology that, and a faith and a practice that continuously dehumanizes women, which is, as Faith and VAWG Coalition members, we all know that women are, for believers, women are an essential part of the co-creative process of the universe. So how can you claim that religion can only be used to oppress women? And I also feel like in terms of resources of funding and sustainability, kind of a secular white supremacist, or even a secular racial, cultural informed approach to philanthropy misses the point with Muslim women, and doesn't understand that actually spirituality and a reclaiming of faith by feminists and Muslim feminists is an essential part of the equation to ending all forms of oppression, not just patriarchy. And that's what got me thinking about my the questionnaire that everyone helpfully at the Faith and VAWG Coalition posted. Thank you very much. And so if you identify as a Muslim feminist, or know a Muslim feminist or activist, or somebody working in the social sector, please send them my forms, Google Forms to complete. So that, because I want to capture, I want to create at least, and having talked with Asifa about that, a virtual space just for healing initially for Muslim women who work in social justice and ending violence against women and girls. And that is it. Finito.